uncover the darkest stories hidden in the shadows. Tonight we delve into the peculiar tale of the Quincy family, whose plantation home stood like a pristine pearl amidst the swampy wilderness of antebellum Louisiana. The year was 1844, when the humid air of Louisiana hung thick with the scent of magnolias and secrets. The Quincy estate, Bellwood, rose from the mist-shrouded banks of the Atchafalaya Basin, a grand Greek revival mansion with columns as white as bleached bone stretching toward a perpetually gray sky. The surrounding cypress trees, draped with Spanish moss, seemed to bow toward the property, as if in reverence to something unnatural dwelling within its walls. The family had arrived from Virginia some 15 years prior, establishing themselves quickly among the plantation aristocracy. Augustus Quincy, the patriarch, had made his fortune in cotton and sugar cane, but whispers among the local townsfolk suggested his wealth stemmed from darker enterprises. His wife, Evangeline, possessed a beauty that seemed frozen in time, her porcelain features unmarked by the Louisiana sun or the passage of years. Their 3 children, Cordelia, Montgomery, and young Elijah, were similarly blessed with an uncanny preservation of youth. Visitors to Bellwood often remarked how the family seemed untouched by time's cruel hand while within the confines of their estate. The house staff, primarily enslaved people who worked the fields and maintained the household, spoke in hushed tones about the strange phenomenon. "Miss Evangeline, she looked the same as the day they arrived," whispered Eulalie, a house servant who had been with the family since their arrival. "But when she go to New Orleans for the season, she come back with lines on her face that vanished the moment she stepped through the door." The Quincy's rarely ventured beyond their property boundaries, emerging only for essential business or the occasional social obligation. When they did, those who encountered them noted an alarming transformation. Augustus's commanding posture would stoop, lines would deepen around Evangeline's eyes, and the children's youthful glow would dim perceptibly. Most curious was the case of Montgomery Quincy, who at 21 years of age embarked on a 3-month tour of Europe in the spring of 1844. Upon his return, witnesses at the New Orleans port reported the arrival of a haggard man of at least 40 years, his hair streaked with gray, his hands trembling with what appeared to be palsy. Yet within days of his return to Bellwood, Montgomery appeared at the annual midsummer ball hosted by the neighboring Fontaine family, looking not a day over 22. The local physician, Dr. Thaddeus Marlowe, developed an obsession with the family's condition. "It defies all medical understanding," he wrote in his journal. Time itself seems suspended within the walls of Bellwood, only to accelerate with vengeful fury once they cross its threshold. As summer heat gave way to autumn chill in 1844, rumors spread through Louisiana parlors of strange rituals conducted in the Quincy basement during moonless nights. Slaves reported hearing chanting in languages unknown to their ears, and the acrid smell of burning herbs would seep from beneath the manor's doors, carrying with it the metallic tang of something unsettlingly like blood. The peculiar temporal anomaly at Bellwood became the subject of whispered speculation throughout St. Martinville Parish, though few dared address it openly in polite society. By late autumn of 1844, the plantation stood increasingly isolated, its wrought iron gates rarely opening to admit visitors. Tendrils of morning fog seemed to linger about the property long after the sun had burned away the mist elsewhere, as though the very elements conspired to shroud the estate in secrecy. Evangeline Quincy's absence from the Michaelmas service at St. Augustine's Episcopal Church caused particular consternation among the parish ladies. When she finally appeared at the harvest cotillion in November, gasps rippled through the assembled gentry. Though she had been away from Bellwood only 3 days, attending to her ailing sister in Baton Rouge, Evangeline's transformation was shocking. Her luminous complexion had turned sallow, fine lines bracketed her mouth, and a pronounced stoop curved her normally elegant posture. "She aged a decade in mere days," wrote Constance Dubois in correspondence to her cousin in Charleston. Yet by Christmas, when the Quincy's hosted their annual soiree, she appeared as youthful as a new bride, her skin bearing the translucent quality of alabaster kissed by candlelight. Most disturbing were the accounts of the Quincy children's tutors, who rarely lasted beyond a single season. Monsieur Laurent, a mathematics instructor from Paris, documented his observations in a journal later discovered among his abandoned possessions. He described young Elijah, allegedly 12 summers old, discussing the intricacies of Revolutionary War strategies with the intimate knowledge of one who had witnessed the events firsthand. The child speaks of General Washington's crossing of the Delaware with such precision of detail, the exact temperature of that Christmas night, the particular formation of ice floes, that I found myself questioning whether I conversed with a boy or some ancient spirit wearing childish guise, Monsieur Laurent wrote before his sudden departure in December. The enslaved people who maintained Bellwood developed elaborate protective rituals. They wore sachets of dried blackthorn and rowan berries beneath their garments, and marked their doorways with symbols derived from their West African heritage. Most refused to enter certain rooms within the main house, particularly the library where Augustus spent his evenings, and the cellar accessible only through a door hidden behind the kitchen hearth. Dorcas, a laundress whose grandmother had practiced root work in Saint-Domingue, claimed the source of the Quincy's unnatural preservation lay beneath the house itself. "The ground speaks to those who listen," she told Dr. Marlowe during one of his surreptitious investigations. Before Bellwood, before the white man's boots touched this soil, the native peoples avoided this land. They said time flows differently here, like water spiraling down a drain. By winter solstice, the Quincy estate had become completely sequestered. Oil lamps burned through the night in the uppermost windows, though no silhouettes could be discerned from the road. The household's provisions arrived via a succession of carriages from New Orleans, their drivers generously compensated for discretion. Most troubling were the reports from neighboring plantations of strange, atonal music drifting across the fields on windless nights, accompanied by what sounded like the weeping of countless voices suspended between one moment and the next. The enigma of Bellwood drew Dr. Thaddeus Marlowe deeper into his investigation as January's bitter chill descended upon Louisiana. A gaunt man of 45 with deep-set eyes and prematurely silver hair, Marlowe had trained at Philadelphia's prestigious Jefferson Medical College before settling in this backward parish. His intellectual curiosity burned far brighter than his modest medical practice required, making the Quincy phenomenon irresistible to his scientific mind. On a particularly frostbitten evening, Marlowe found himself in the study of Father Sebastien Gautier, the elderly Jesuit priest whose knowledge of local history predated American acquisition of the territory. Gautier's papery hands trembled as he unlocked an ancient cedar chest, extracting a leather portfolio tied with faded ribbon. These lands were not always called Bellwood, Father Gautier murmured, his Acadian accent thickening with each word. The Chitimacha people named it Naatsikatsina, the place where time sleeps. Their shamans would visit to commune with ancestors not yet born and descendants long dead. The priest's rheumy eyes flickered toward the window. When the Spanish came, they built a mission here in 1762. Every friar assigned to convert the natives died within a year, not from violence or disease, but from inexplicable aging. Their journals described waking daily with more gray hairs, deeper wrinkles, brittler bones. Marlowe examined crude drawings in the portfolio, depicting native symbols etched into limestone beneath what would now be the Quincy Foundation. Augustus Quincy knew what he purchased, Father Gautier whispered. The previous owner, Monsieur Thibodeau, warned him explicitly. Thibodeau's entire family had perished. Venturing away for mere weeks, they returned as husks barely clinging to life. That same evening, across the parish, Cordelia Quincy contemplated her reflection in the gilt-framed mirror of her bedchamber. At 23, her copper-hued hair cascaded in thick waves down her back, her complexion unblemished as fresh cream. Her green eyes, however, contained the weariness of decades. The knock at her door came precisely at midnight. Montgomery entered, handsome as ever in his brocade dressing gown. Yet his eyes matched the ancient quality of his sister's. "Father insists we attend the governor's ball in New Orleans," he said without preamble. 6 days away from Bellwood. Cordelia's gloved hand fluttered to her throat. 6 days? We'll return resembling our own parents. Surely he cannot expect. He's discovered something new in the cellar texts, Montgomery interrupted. A method to slow the acceleration. We're to consume this tincture thrice daily while away. He produced a crystal vial filled with viscous amber liquid. And the price? Cordelia whispered, for there was always a price. Montgomery's aristocratic features hardened. Upon our return, we must participate in the renewal. All of us, including young Elijah. Cordelia paled visibly. At 13, Elijah had never participated in the ritual that sustained Bellwood's temporal sanctuary. The boy's cherubic face and innocent laughter belied his true nature. He alone among them had been born within the house's walls, had never experienced normal time's flow. Elijah doesn't understand what we are, she protested, what this house demands. Montgomery's laugh held no mirth. None of us did, sister, when Father brought us here from Virginia. None of us comprehended what bargain he'd struck with forces older than this continent. He placed the vial on her dressing table. Choose, Cordelia. Age like common mortals, or embrace our legacy. Outside, the moss-draped cypresses bent unnaturally toward the mansion, as though pulled by an invisible tide. Deep within Bellwood's foundations, something ancient stirred in anticipation. The journey to New Orleans proceeded with grim inevitability. The Quincy carriage departed at dawn, its ebony chassis gleaming like an obsidian carapace against the pearl-gray horizon. Augustus sat rigid in his velvet-upholstered seat, periodically consulting a silver chronometer that never seemed to require winding. With each mile marker passed, the family sipped from individual crystal vials, grimacing as the amber liquid, tasting of burnt honey and corroded metal, slid down their throats. By the second day, despite their elixir, the transformation had begun. Evangeline's luminous skin developed a network of fine lines like hairline fractures in porcelain. Augustus's knuckles swelled painfully, forcing him to remove his signet ring. Montgomery developed a persistent cough that speckled his handkerchief with alarming crimson blooms. Only Cordelia and Elijah seemed to weather the journey with minimal deterioration, though Cordelia's vibrant copper tresses now showed strands of ashen gray at her temples. "The children have always fared better," Evangeline observed one evening at a roadside inn, her voice carrying a new rasp. "Perhaps their connection to the house is more symbiotic." Elijah, watching the exchange with unnervingly adult eyes, fingered a curious amulet hanging from a leather cord around his neck, a flat stone inscribed with markings identical to those in the drawings Dr. Marlowe had examined. The boy had never relinquished the talisman since his 5th birthday, when Augustus had presented it with unusual solemnity. The governor's ball proved a calculated humiliation. Though still handsome by conventional standards, the once ethereal Quincy's now appeared merely mortal, prosperous planters of middle years with their attractive progeny. Society matrons who had envied Evangeline's ageless beauty now cast triumphant glances her way, whispering behind painted fans, "How satisfying to see that even the remarkable Mrs. Quincy cannot escape time's verdict forever," remarked the acid-tongued Mrs. Dalrymple to her circle. What these observers could not perceive was the vertiginous horror experienced by the Quincy's themselves, the sensation of decades compressing into days, of mortality crushing down upon them like the weight of loam upon a coffin lid. Each member of the family endured this temporal vertigo differently. Augustus grew taciturn and harsh. Evangeline withdrew into migraine-induced seclusion. Montgomery drank excessively, his hands trembling uncontrollably by the 4th night. Most disturbing was the change in young Elijah. As his chronological age accelerated toward what appeared to be late adolescence, he developed an unsettling preoccupation with the slave quarters adjacent to their rented townhouse. The housemaid discovered him before dawn on their final day, conversing in fluid chitimacha with an elderly gardener who supposedly spoke only French. "What passes between that house and our flesh isn't magic," Elijah informed Cordelia later. His voice deepened seemingly overnight. His childish cadence entirely vanished. "It's commerce. The house requires sustenance to maintain its temporal aberration." "What manner of sustenance?" Cordelia whispered, though she had long suspected. Elijah's smile contained centuries of terrible knowledge. "Why do you think Father insists we bring back 3 new household servants? The house hungers for time not rightfully its own." The Quincy carriage departed New Orleans on the 6th day, carrying not only the visibly aged family, but also 3 young women purchased from the slave market, sisters with matching copper bracelets and terror-filled eyes that darted continuously toward the strange boy who watched them with ancient, patient hunger. Dr. Marlowe's journal entries from that February revealed a man descending into obsession. His normally meticulous handwriting deteriorated into frantic scrawls as he documented the Quincy's return to Bellwood. February 12, 1844. Observed the family's carriage passing through town at dusk. Augustus appeared at least 60 years of age, though he cannot be more than 45. More disturbing still was young Elijah, who in mere weeks away has transformed from child to youth. The 3 young women accompanying them sat rigid with fear, their eyes vacant as though their spirits had already fled their bodies. The doctor's curiosity compelled him to trespass where prudence would have forbidden. On the night of the full moon, disguised as a traveling medicine peddler, he gained entrance to the outer buildings of Bellwood. There he encountered Dorcas, the laundress, who led him to a small cabin at the edge of the property. "The sisters they brought back," she whispered. "Only one remains. The others—" Her voice faltered as she crossed herself with trembling fingers. The surviving sister, Matilda, lay curled upon a pallet, her copper bracelet still circling her wrist. But the young woman who had boarded the carriage in New Orleans was gone. In her place lay a crone of perhaps 80 years, her skin like crumpled parchment, her once black hair now white as swamp cotton. "They took us below," Matilda rasped, her ancient eyes finding Marlowe's in the lantern light. "There's a room with no windows, floor carved with stars and moons. They stood us in circles and spoke words that made the air heavy." Her withered hand clutched at the physician's sleeve. The master cut his palm, then the mistress, then the children. When the youngest boy sliced his hand, he smiled like he was tasting sugar. "That blood, it didn't fall. It floated, doctor, floated up like smoke." She described how candles extinguished without human intervention, how the stone floor throbbed beneath their bare feet, and how the oldest sister collapsed first, her youth visibly draining away as Augustus Quincy straightened, his wrinkles smoothing before their eyes. "The second night they took my middle sister," Matilda continued. "I was to be third, but something went wrong. The young master, Montgomery, he started screaming about balance and cost, said the house was taking too much. That's when they brought me here instead." Dr. Marlowe documented a curious phenomenon. Matilda's accelerated aging slowed considerably once removed from the main house, yet showed no signs of reversal. More alarming was his discovery that the dateline in his journal had somehow altered. What he believed to be a 2-day investigation had consumed 2 weeks, though his pocket watch indicated only 48 hours had passed. Father Gautier, upon reviewing Marlowe's findings, produced a faded map from the Spanish colonial archives. Bellwood sits precisely at the convergence of what the Chitimacha called sleeping rivers of time, he explained. Their legends speak of how these rivers occasionally reverse their flow. When this happens, those caught in the current might live decades in moments, or moments in decades. A letter from Eugenia Fontaine to her cousin in Boston, dated March 3rd, described a chance encounter with Evangeline Quincy in St. Martinville. She appeared as youthful as when first she arrived in Louisiana 15 years past, a miracle of preservation. Yet when she believed herself unobserved, I glimpsed an expression of such aged weariness in her eyes that I found myself shuddering. It was as though something ancient and terrible gazed out from behind a beautiful mask. The night of the spring equinox brought an unseasonable chill to Louisiana, dew crystallizing on magnolia leaves like tiny diamonds. Dr. Marlowe found himself once again at Bellwood's periphery, drawn by an irresistible intellectual thirst that overwhelmed his growing dread. He had established a makeshift observation post in an abandoned gardener's shed, its weathered slats offering narrow views of the main house. Through his brass spyglass, he observed the Quincy family gathering in what appeared to be ritualistic formation on the rear terrace. Evangeline, resplendent in ivory silk that caught the moonlight, her restored youth almost luminescent against the night. Augustus, commanding and vital, gesturing toward the heavens with the confidence of one who had bent natural law to his will. The 3 children arranged in ascending height, their faces solemn as clerics before communion. The equinox held significance. This much Marlowe had gleaned from Father Gautier's historical fragments. The precise alignment of day and night created what the Chitimacha called the balanced breath, when the barriers between temporal planes grew porous. The ritual demands symmetry, Matilda had explained during their last interview, her aged hands trembling as she shaped the air descriptively. For each year they reclaim, something, someone, must surrender an equal measure. The household ledger Marlowe had surreptitiously examined revealed a disturbing pattern. Every equinox and solstice for 15 years, new servants arrived at Bellwood. None appeared in subsequent records beyond 3 months. The mathematics of stolen time became horrifyingly clear. A flicker of movement drew Marlowe's eye back to his spyglass. The family had adjourned indoors, but a solitary figure remained on the moonlit lawn. Montgomery Quincy, his tall frame unmistakable even at distance. The young man paced with evident agitation, occasionally glancing toward the slave quarters with an expression Marlowe could only interpret as conflicted anguish. Later testimony from Eulalie would confirm what Marlowe witnessed next. Montgomery stealing toward the outbuildings, urgently rousing several enslaved families. pressing small objects into their palms, what appeared to be protective amulets similar to Elijah's. His whispers carried fragments across the silver dew grass. "Cannot bear this burden, must flee before dawn, tell no one." Inside the main house, the foundations thrummed with unnatural energy. Cordelia Quincy stood before her dressing mirror, methodically removing her pearl earrings. The polished glass reflected not only her youthful countenance but, momentarily, a superimposition of what might have been: hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, gray-threaded hair, her true age flickering like a daguerreotype negative before settling again into perfect youth. "You assisted Montgomery," came Elijah's voice from her doorway. No longer a child's timbre, but the measured cadence of a man grown. Cordelia did not turn. "He has developed a conscience. Most inconvenient. Father will be displeased. Father is not immortal, merely—" She paused, considering. "Temporally advantaged. As are we all." Elijah stepped into the room, his adolescent frame casting a shadow disproportionately elongated against the wallpaper. The house knows. It always knows when the balance shifts. Beneath them, in the carved chamber Matilda had described, Augustus Quincy stood alone, his palm pressed against ancient stone that pulsed with warmth like a living heart. His whispered communion was neither prayer nor incantation, but something older, a negotiation with forces that had dwelt in this convergence long before human settlement. "We have honored our covenant," he murmured to the receptive stone. "But my son threatens everything we have sacrificed to build." The walls of Bellwood seemed to inhale around him, waiting. The following dawn bathed Bellwood in unnatural light, a sickly amber glow that seemed to emanate from the very soil rather than the ascending sun. Dr. Marlowe, who had fallen into uneasy slumber at his observation post, awoke to discover that his pocket watch had stopped precisely at 3 minutes past midnight, the moment of perfect equinoctial balance. More disturbing still was the realization that what he had assumed to be morning was, according to the church bells tolling distantly from St. Martinville, actually late afternoon. Somehow, 15 hours had vanished from his perception like morning mist burned away by merciless sun. Within the estate's boundaries, chaos reigned. The previous night's events had culminated in a temporal disturbance unprecedented even in Bellwood's unnatural history. The enslaved families Montgomery had attempted to help, 6 souls in total, were discovered at the property line, their bodies contorted in grotesque positions that defied anatomical possibility. Their features displayed the paradoxical characteristics of both extreme youth and advanced age simultaneously. Infant smooth skin stretched over arthritic, gnarled hands, snow-white hair sprouting from unlined scalps, milky cataracts clouding eyes with the bright curiosity of children. "They tried to cross the boundary carrying protection not meant for them," Evangeline explained to her ashen-faced daughters as she calmly supervised the burial. "The amulets disrupted the natural transfer. The house took what it was owed in a single moment rather than gradual collection." The St. Martinville Gazette, in its April 2nd edition of 1844, carried a peculiar notice. "Authorities seek information regarding the whereabouts of Montgomery Quincy, heir to the Bellwood estate, last seen during equinoctial celebrations. The young gentleman, known for his exemplary character and handsome appearance, reportedly embarked on an unscheduled journey without appropriate farewells. The elder Mr. Quincy offers substantial reward for knowledge of his son's location." What the notice failed to mention was discovered by Marlowe in his subsequent inquiries. The sudden appearance of an unidentified elderly man at the Nelson Creek ferry crossing, some 7 miles from Bellwood. The ferryman's description was detailed in a parish constable's report. The gentleman possessed no identification nor funds, though his tattered clothing appeared once fine in quality. Most peculiar was his insistence that he was Montgomery Quincy, despite appearing no less than 70 years of age. His ravings concerning temporal theft and the house that consumes years led me to believe him mentally unsound. When questioned about the Quincy family, he became violently distressed, claiming to have been cast out for defying the covenant. The unfortunate man was remanded to the New Orleans Asylum for the Insane. Meanwhile, within Bellwood's Greek revival walls, young Elijah ascended to his missing brother's position with disturbing poise. Now appearing a young man of perhaps 20, though chronologically only 13, he conducted family business with the confidence of one who had lived multiple lifetimes. The ledgers previously maintained by Montgomery now bore Elijah's elegant script, including a chilling notation beside 3 new names. Acquired from Mississippi Territory. Unattached. No family to make inquiries. Estimated temporal yield, 12 years each. Augustus Quincy, observing his youngest son's efficiency, penned a private letter to an unnamed correspondent in Boston. The succession is secured. The boy understands what his brother could not accept, that our covenant with this land requires sacrifice. In exchange for what we surrender, we receive time's greatest gift, the ability to exist beyond its mortal constraints. The parish chronicles fell silent about Bellwood through the sweltering summer of 1844, as though the very name had become unspeakable in polite society. Dr. Marlowe's observations grew increasingly intermittent, his journal entries scattered and disjointed, fragments of thoughts rather than his previously methodical documentation. Those who encountered the physician noted his suddenly stooped posture and prematurely lined face, as though the burden of his knowledge extracted its own temporal toll. August brought relentless, suffocating heat that seemed to concentrate around the Quincy estate. Plantation workers on neighboring properties reported seeing curling wreaths of mist rising from Bellwood's grounds even under the midday sun, mist that moved against prevailing winds, always spiraling toward the main house as if drawn by inexorable purpose. "The house is feeding more frequently now," Dorcas whispered to Eulalie as they gathered collard greens beyond the property boundary. "Since young Master Montgomery departed, it hungers deeper. 3 new ones gone in 6 weeks, when before it might have been 1 per season." The disappearances might have continued unremarked, but for an unexpected development. Cordelia Quincy, who had never shown inclination toward maternal instincts, announced her betrothal to Ambrose Whitmore, son of a prominent New Orleans shipping magnate. The engagement necessitated social obligations that would require extended absence from Bellwood, an unprecedented challenge to the family's carefully maintained temporal sanctuary. Preparations for the engagement soiree consumed the household. Evangeline was observed personally instructing the remaining house servants in elaborate arrangements, her manner betraying unusual tension. Augustus disappeared into the basement chamber for 3 consecutive nights, emerging each dawn more haggard than before, only to appear restored to youthful vitality by sunset. Most disturbing were the modifications made to the estate's grounds. Under Elijah's exacting supervision, stonemasons installed 7 marble plinths at precise intervals around the property perimeter. Each bore inscriptions in a script Father Gautier identified as ancient Etruscan, a language predating even the Latin texts in his ecclesiastical library. "They are preparing something unprecedented," the elderly priest confided to Marlowe during their clandestine meeting at the parish boundary. "The symbols speak of temporal anchoring, a means of extending the house's influence beyond its physical foundations." On the night before the engagement celebration, as the moon hung full and gravid above the Louisiana cypress, Matilda dragged her aged form to Marlowe's cottage, her breath coming in desperate gasps. "They intend to bring time itself to heal," she wheezed, clutching a parchment fragment bearing Augustus Quincy's unmistakable handwriting. "The daughter wishes to leave without consequence, to maintain youth while away. The father has found a way, but the cost." Her withered fingers trembled as she indicated a calculation inked in the margin. 37 souls required for temporal extension. "Not just household servants," Matilda continued, her ancient eyes wide with horror. "The entire engagement party. Every guest who crosses their threshold tomorrow will contribute unwittingly to the expansion of their unnatural covenant." The engagement soiree at Bellwood transformed the mansion into a glittering spectacle. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across cream-colored walls, while garlands of hothouse flowers perfumed the air with an almost narcotic sweetness. 53 of Louisiana's most distinguished families arrived in procession, their carriages forming a gleaming serpent winding up the cypress-lined drive. Each vehicle passed between the newly installed marble plinths, which seemed to pulse with subtle luminescence as shadows lengthened across the manicured grounds. Ambrose Whitmore, resplendent in tailored evening wear imported from London, appeared blissfully ignorant of his bride-to-be's true nature. His open countenance radiated the simple joy of a man who believed he had secured an advantageous match with a beautiful, wealthy young woman. The 27-year-old shipping heir circulated among guests with practiced charm, unaware that Cordelia observed him with the calculated assessment of a scientist monitoring an experiment. "He will remain in New Orleans while I travel between," Cordelia murmured to Elijah as they stood on the mezzanine overlooking the grand foyer. Father's anchoring ritual should maintain my condition during shorter absences. Elijah's eyes, so disconcertingly ancient in his youthful face, followed the movements of the guests below. Each crossing weakens the barriers, he observed. Eventually, the temporal distortion will become noticeable to even the most unobservant. By then, it will be too late, Cordelia replied. The anchors will extend our sanctuary's influence with each sacrifice made tonight. From his concealed position among the catering staff, Dr. Marlowe noted with mounting horror how the Quincy's systematically encouraged their guests to disperse throughout Bellwood's many rooms. At precisely 9:47, Augustus raised his champagne flute, proposing an elaborate toast that required all present to drink simultaneously. The crystal glasses contained not just imported champagne, but infinitesimal amounts of amber liquid from the Quincy's private vials. "To unions," Augustus proclaimed, his voice carrying to every corner of the mansion, "to the binding of families, futures, and fortunes. May time deal gently with us all." As the assembled guests drank deeply, an imperceptible tremor passed through Bellwood's foundations. The marble plinths surrounding the property flared briefly with cold blue light, visible only to those specifically watching for the phenomenon. Within minutes, several elderly guests reported feeling unexpectedly invigorated, while younger attendees touched their temples in momentary confusion. Father Gautier, who had positioned himself at the parish church to observe from a distance, documented an extraordinary sight. Bellwood appeared to shimmer within a heat haze despite the evening chill, its outline momentarily blurring as though viewed through rippling water. More alarmingly, the distortion expanded perceptibly beyond the estate's boundaries, reaching perhaps a quarter-mile in all directions before stabilizing. "The covenant extends," the priest wrote in trembling script. "God help anyone who resides within its new territory, for they are now unwitting participants in the Quincy's blasphemous bargain with time itself." By midnight, as guests departed with unusual lethargy, Evangeline Quincy stood alone in her dressing room, examining her reflection with clinical detachment. For the first time in 15 years, she unfastened the pearl choker that had never left her neck, revealing beneath it the thin, jagged scar that encircled her throat like a second silent mouth. The forgotten journal of Eulalie Bernard, discovered among the personal effects of Dr. Thaddeus Marlowe after his mysterious disappearance in the autumn of 1844, provides the most intimate glimpse into Bellwood's inner workings. Written in a near-illiterate hand on scraps of kitchen receipts and laundry lists, the document remained untranslated from its Creole French until 1893, when it was donated to the Louisiana Historical Society by Marlowe's great-niece. "The young master Elijah speaks with the house," Eulalie wrote, "not in words like Christian folk, but through blood offerings made at the new moon. He carries a silver blade no longer than my little finger, and when the family retires, he wanders the halls making small cuts upon the door frames of rooms where guests will sleep. I have seen him collect the blood that rises to his own palm in a tiny crystal bowl no bigger than a thimble." Most disturbing was Eulalie's account of the aftermath of the engagement soiree. 3 days following the celebration, residents of neighboring properties began reporting inexplicable physical changes. The widowed Mrs. Thibault, whose modest cottage stood just within the expanded boundary, discovered her decades-old rheumatism mysteriously vanished. Conversely, her 16-year-old grandson woke one morning to find his first gray hairs and inexplicable arthritic swelling in his previously nimble fingers. "The balance must be maintained," Eulalie recorded. "Master Augustus explained it to Miss Cordelia as I served their breakfast. For each year reclaimed by one inside the boundary, another must surrender an equal measure. The stones they placed make everyone within their reach part of the exchange, willing or not." Parish records substantiate a curious demographic shift in the vicinity of Bellwood during this period. Death certificates show an unprecedented number of accelerated aging cases among the young, while several elderly residents exhibited remarkable longevity and restoration of faculties typically diminished by advancing years. Dr. Marlowe's final journal entry, dated September 17th, reveals his desperate gambit. "I have secured an invitation to dine at Bellwood tomorrow evening. Augustus Quincy believes I come to discuss treatment for Evangeline's headaches, but my true purpose is to obtain physical evidence of their temporal manipulation. Father Gautier has provided an amulet of considerable antiquity which may offer some protection against the house's influence. I carry also a vial of blessed water from the Chitimacha burial ground, which the tribe's last surviving elder assures me will disrupt the covenant's foundation if applied to the central stone in the basement chamber. The invitation card found among Marlowe's effects confirms the appointment, though no record exists of his having kept it. A subsequent notation in the Quincy household accounts ledger, written in Elijah's precise hand, includes a cryptic entry. Recompense to Duval brothers for discreet removal of medical equipment and personal effects from Marlowe residence. Donation of said items to New Orleans Charity Hospital made in the good doctor's name, as befits his final wishes. The temporal anomaly surrounding Bellwood continued to strengthen throughout the autumn of 1844, its influence slowly expanding like ripples across the still surface of a darkened pond. The winter of 1844 yielded to spring with reluctant grace, frost lingering in the shadowed hollows of Bellwood long after the surrounding countryside bloomed with wildflowers. What documents survive from this period suggest a terrible symmetry unfolding as Bellwood's influence expanded outward. Those within its heart experienced an ever-deepening temporal distortion. A meteorological survey conducted by the University of Louisiana noted an unexplained atmospheric phenomenon centered over the Quincy estate. Despite identical weather conditions, timepieces within 3 miles of Bellwood ran at inconsistent speeds, losing or gaining minutes unpredictably. Sundials cast shadows at angles that defied astronomical calculations. Plants within the expanding boundary exhibited bizarre growth patterns. Century-old live oaks sprouted new growth typically seen only in saplings, while freshly planted garden rows aged and withered within days. Among Father Gautier's papers, preserved by the diocesan archives, lies a confession transcribed from Evangeline Quincy during Lenten services. The document bears the seal of confidentiality, broken only after the priest's death in 1866. "It began in Virginia, not here," she whispered to the aging priest. "Augustus discovered the first stone circle on our family plantation when a sinkhole opened after spring floods. The markings matched his grandfather's journals describing ancient methods of chronological suspension. My husband's ambition was merely to preserve our youth a few additional years, a wealthy man's vanity. But the process required sacrifice even then. Our oldest servant was the first. We told everyone she had retired to her sister's home." The confession continues with chilling precision. What Augustus didn't anticipate was the hunger, not his hunger, the hunger of whatever dwells within such places. When we transplanted the central stone to Louisiana, building Bellwood atop this stronger convergence, the hunger grew. Now it demands more than we ever intended to give. I fear we have become mere caretakers for something that existed long before humanity crawled from the mud. Most revealing is the correspondence between Cordelia Quincy and her fiancé, Ambrose Whitmore, throughout April and May. The letters, discovered in a hidden compartment of Whitmore's writing desk after his estate auction in 1872, document a disturbing transformation. "Dearest Ambrose," Cordelia wrote in flowing script dated April 3rd, "I count the days until our June wedding with mounting anticipation. Father has graciously offered Bellwood as our permanent residence, with the east wing entirely renovated for our private apartments. I cannot bear the thought of establishing our home elsewhere, though I understand your business requires regular presence in New Orleans." By May 27th, her tone had shifted notably. "You speak of aging as though it were inevitable, my darling. Have you not noticed how the minor afflictions that troubled you, your childhood asthma, the weakness in your left wrist from that riding accident, have mysteriously abated since our engagement? This is Bellwood's gift to those it accepts. Think of what this could mean for our future children, generations of Whitmores untouched by time's cruelty." On the reverse of this final letter, apparently never sent, Ambrose had scrawled a single line in trembling hand. "She does not blink. I have watched. Even when startled, her eyes never close." Beyond Bellwood's boundaries, as spring yielded to the relentless heat of Louisiana summer, strange tales proliferated throughout St. Martinville. Children were born with eyes that seemed to hold the weariness of the elderly. Farmers reported finding their morning-planted seeds fully grown by eventide, withering before harvest could be gathered. Parish records documented inexplicable cases where infants aged visibly between christening and the journey home, their soft features hardening with premature lines that disappeared upon crossing back into Bellwood's expanding influence. The wedding of Cordelia Quincy and Ambrose Whitmore proceeded with macabre splendor on the summer solstice. The bride appeared almost luminous in her pearl-encrusted gown. her ageless beauty drawing gasps from assembled guests. Few noticed how the groom's previously robust frame had grown gaunt, how his once steady hands trembled as he placed the ring upon his bride's finger. Fewer still observed the 7 blank-faced servants positioned at precise intervals around the garden ceremony, each wearing identical copper bracelets, each standing upon one of the marble plinths now disguised beneath elaborate floral arrangements. "The exchange must be consecrated," Augustus murmured to Elijah as the couple exchanged vows beneath a trellis of night-blooming jasmine. "The temporal covenant requires symbolic union on this of all days, when the balance between seasons shifts most dramatically." Elijah nodded, his adolescent face betraying momentary discomfort as he watched his sister seal her marriage with a kiss that seemed to physically drain the color from Ambrose's cheeks. Will he understand what he has become part of? "He needn't understand," Augustus replied, absently touching the medallion concealed beneath his formal waistcoat. "He need only remain within the boundary. The house will extract what it requires regardless of his comprehension." That evening, as celebration continued in the grand ballroom, Eulalie witnessed Ambrose alone in Augustus's study, frantically rifling through leather-bound ledgers. His discoveries must have confirmed some terrible suspicion, for the young man's face contorted in horror before settling into the blank resignation of one who recognizes his fate is irrevocably sealed. "Your father," he later whispered to Cordelia as they danced before their approving guests, "keeps meticulous accounts of all you have taken. 37 lives consumed completely. Hundreds more partially harvested. What manner of monsters have I married into?" Cordelia's smile never faltered, though her grip on her new husband's arm tightened perceptibly. "Not monsters, my love. Pioneers. We have found what emperors and alchemists sought for millennia. Time itself made malleable. All advancement requires sacrifice. Ours is simply more transparent in its accounting." The consummation of their union that night occurred in a bedchamber, where mirrors had been strategically positioned to reflect moonlight onto ancient symbols carved into the bedposts. With each passionate embrace, observers in the garden below would later report seeing tendrils of silvery mist rising from the newlyweds' window, spiraling upward to join the waxing moon. While in nearby slave quarters, 3 elderly women breathed their last, their bodies crumbling to dust with unnatural rapidity, like centuries of decay compressed into moments. The summer heat surrendered to autumn's first whispers, but within Bellwood's expanding dominion, seasons seemed mere suggestions rather than natural law. Leaves upon the boundary periphery blazed with October's fiery hues, while those within remained verdant and unnaturally supple, as though nature itself grew confused about which temporal rules to follow. Ambrose Whitmore's integration into the Quincy household progressed with the methodical precision of a clock being wound. Each morning he arose beside Cordelia, his once robust frame increasingly gaunt, his eyes developing the same ageless quality that characterized all permanent residents of Bellwood. His correspondence with business associates in New Orleans dwindled, replaced by hours spent in Augustus's study, poring over ancient texts extracted from hidden compartments beneath the library floorboards. "The house accepts him," Evangeline observed one evening as mist curled around the colonnade like spectral fingers. "It consumes his natural years more gradually than the others." Augustus nodded, tracing his fingertip along the rim of his brandy glass, producing an eerie resonance that seemed to harmonize with the mansion's constant subliminal hum. "He possesses unexpected aptitude for the work. His shipping knowledge proves valuable, understanding how various elements flow and converge." The temporal currents function similarly. The household ledger, now maintained by both Elijah and Ambrose, contained disturbing new categories. Entries labeled partial extraction designated individuals within the extended boundary who unknowingly contributed temporal essence while continuing their daily existence. Most alarming were annotations indicating systematic harvesting clusters, entire families whose accelerated aging nourished the Quincy's unnatural vitality. Throughout the parish, physicians documented unprecedented medical anomalies. Children developed arthritis typically seen in the elderly. Septuagenarians experienced spontaneous restoration of youthful faculties, only to collapse days later, their bodies deteriorating as though decades of aging occurred in hours. The temporal distortions rippled outward with increasing volatility, disrupting the natural order with escalating intensity. Upon All Hallows' Eve, when the veil between temporal planes traditionally thinned, Augustus implemented the ritual he had been meticulously planning since Montgomery's departure. The family gathered in the basement chamber, joined by Ambrose, whose initial revulsion had transformed into terrible fascination. 7 copper bowls positioned at precise intervals contained various essences: clock oil from timepieces spanning 3 centuries, sand from hourglasses used to time executions, water in which cadavers had been washed. "Tonight, we sever our dependence on proximity," Augustus intoned, his voice reverberating unnaturally against stone walls that seemed to breathe. "The anchor points have established sufficient resonance. We begin phase 3, temporal autonomy." Evangeline removed her pearl choker, revealing the scar that encircled her throat like a second mouth. Cordelia unbuttoned her high collar, displaying an identical marking. Elijah and Ambrose simultaneously rolled up their sleeves, exposing fresh, surgical incisions that formed perfect circles around their wrists. Only Augustus remained unmarked, though he removed from his waistcoat pocket a silver lancet with ceremonial deliberation. "The final binding requires blood from the Covenant's originator," he explained, positioning the blade against his throat. "When complete, Bellwood's influence becomes untethered from physical location. We may travel without consequence, carrying our sanctuary within us." Outside, thunder rumbled across skies that had been clear moments before. The ancient cypress trees surrounding the estate bent inward, their moss-draped limbs stretching toward the mansion like supplicants before an altar. Deep within the earth beneath Bellwood, something immeasurably old stirred from dormancy, anticipating the completion of a cycle begun centuries before the first human set foot on this continent. The marriage of Cordelia and Ambrose heralded transformations beyond mere domestic arrangements. By December of 1844, the Whitmore shipping interests had become inexplicably efficient, with vessels arriving days ahead of schedule, cargo manifests containing impossible bounties harvested out of season. Business competitors whispered of supernatural intervention, while dock workers refused assignments on Whitmore ships after witnessing crewmen who appeared to age and rejuvenate between voyages like time-ravaged accordions. Within Bellwood itself, the completion of Augustus's Phase 3 ritual manifested in subtly horrifying ways. Evangeline, whose movements had previously been restricted to the estate and brief, carefully timed excursions, now traveled freely to New Orleans for extended periods. Those who encountered her at winter social functions noted her complexion's remarkable luminosity, undiminished regardless of duration away from home. The scar encircling her throat, normally concealed beneath high collars and pearl chokers, occasionally caught the light with an unnatural gleam, as though the wound contained microscopic remnants of some metallic substance. "The binding has altered us at our most fundamental level," Ambrose wrote in his private journal, discovered decades later sealed within a lead box beneath the garden folly. "I feel something ancient circulating through my veins alongside my natural blood, a presence that observes through my eyes, listens through my ears, yet remains distinct from my consciousness. It hungers constantly, drawing sustenance not merely from those we designate as sacrifices, but from fleeting encounters with every soul I pass. Each handshake, each conversation leaves the other imperceptibly diminished while strengthening what now dwells within me." The parish winter festival, traditionally held in the town square on the winter solstice, became the stage for the most public demonstration of Bellwood's expanding influence. All 5 Quincy's attended, their first collective appearance at a community function in nearly a year. They arrived as twilight descended, bringing with them an unnatural chill that caused candle flames throughout the square to burn with blue-tinged light. Father Gautier, observing from the church steps, documented how the family moved through the crowd with preternatural grace, each seemingly casual touch leaving recipients momentarily disoriented. Children who accepted peppermint sticks from Evangeline's gloved hands developed silver-streaked hair within hours. Elderly townsfolk who shared mulled wine with Augustus found themselves suddenly clear-eyed and steady-footed, while their middle-aged children collapsed with mysterious exhaustion. Most disturbing was the testimony of Henriette Laveau, a washerwoman with documented second sight, who claimed to perceive shadow cords extending from each Quincy's chest, connecting them not only to each other, but back toward Bellwood itself, despite the estate lying miles distant. "They have become vessels," she whispered to Dr. Marlowe's successor, the skeptical but increasingly troubled Dr. Franklin Pierce. "Empty chalices filled with something that never belonged in human form." The house has learned to walk abroad using their bodies as carriages. As the year drew to its close, parish records documented an unprecedented 37 deaths between Christmas and New Year's Eve, each victim exhibiting signs of extreme desiccation, as though years of aging had been compressed into hours. Concurrently, the Quincy's hosted their grandest celebration yet, a masquerade ball where attendees reported feeling extraordinarily vivified, departing at dawn with ailments cured and vigor restored, blissfully ignorant of the invisible threads now binding them to Bellwood's insatiable covenant. The first thaw of 1845 arrived with unsettling prematurity, as though winter itself retreated from Bellwood's expanding influence. February brought blooming jasmine and mockingbirds where frost should have lingered, the unnatural acceleration affecting not just human lives, but the very cadence of seasons within the distortion's reach. From the attic observatory of St. Augustine's Episcopal Church, Father Gautier trained his brass telescope not toward heavenly bodies, but upon the Quincy estate, meticulously charting the visible boundary of temporal aberration. The demarcation had become perceptible even to untrained eyes, a shimmer like heat rising from summer stones, a threshold where birdsong abruptly altered pitch, where light refracted at impossible angles. The effect expands approximately 12 feet per lunar cycle, he recorded in trembling script, his once elegant penmanship betraying the palsy that had afflicted him since his clandestine investigation. At current progression, it will encompass St. Martinville proper by autumnal equinox. Within this expanding dominion, the Quincy's moved with increasing detachment from human concerns. Their interactions with society became performances executed with technical precision, but devoid of authentic emotion, perfect replicas of human connection crafted by entities that no longer remembered the genuine article. Ambrose alone retained fragmentary vestiges of his former self, though these diminished with each passing day. During rare unobserved moments, he would stand before mirrors, pressing fingertips against the cold glass as if seeking confirmation of his continued corporeal existence. The reflection that stared back showed a man physically unchanged from his wedding day, yet fundamentally transformed. His eyes possessed the same depthless quality that characterized all Bellwood's residents, as though one gazed not at windows to a soul, but at carefully crafted simulacra of humanity. "I dream of clocks," he confessed in coded correspondence to his estranged brother in Boston, timepieces with hands moving simultaneously forward and backward. "In these dreams, I stand within an endless room where thousands of hourglasses pour their sand upward against natural law. Most disturbing is the certainty upon waking that these are not dreams at all, but glimpses into the true nature of what we have become." The covenant's expansion manifested in increasingly alarming phenomena throughout the parish. Mothers reported children who aged visibly during afternoon naps, only to revert to proper development by supper time. Farmers discovered fields where half their crops withered, while adjacent rows flourished impossibly, the division line corresponding precisely to Father Gautier's charted boundary. Most terrifying were incidents involving those who attempted to flee the affected region. The Lafitte family, having witnessed their youngest daughter oscillate between childhood and adolescence within a single day, loaded their possessions and departed for relatives in Mobile. 3 days later, their carriage returned, driverless and spectral, the horses unnaturally gaunt yet moving with mechanical precision. Inside, searchers discovered the family frozen in attitudes of terrible realization, their bodies desiccated as though centuries had passed, yet their expressions preserved in the moment they understood escape was impossible. As spring equinox approached, Augustus summoned his expanded family to the basement chamber for what the household ledger designated Covenant Reinforcement Ritual, Phase 4. The innocuous bureaucratic terminology belied the eldritch horror of what transpired beneath Bellwood's foundations, a ceremony that would irreversibly alter not merely the Quincy dynasty, but the fundamental temporal architecture of the region they had come to dominate. On the spring equinox of 1845, as mist clung to Bellwood's columns like spectral shrouds, Father Gautier ascended the church tower one final time. His withered hands, spotted with age that had accelerated unnaturally since his investigations began, trembled as he focused his telescope upon the Quincy estate. What he witnessed would be recorded in a sealed letter addressed to the Archbishop of New Orleans, to be opened only after his death. The mansion pulsed with lambent energy that coursed through the marble plinths in rhythmic waves, like a colossal heart-pumping vitality through stone arteries. The boundary's shimmer had solidified into a translucent dome that encompassed not merely the estate, but nearly 2 miles of surrounding countryside. Within this hemisphere, reality itself appeared to undulate, as though the very fabric of existence had become unstable. At precisely noon, when the balance between night and day achieved momentary perfection, Augustus Quincy led his family and 7 selected servants onto the rear terrace. They arranged themselves in a precise formation that, viewed from above, formed an ancient sigil, one that Father Gautier recognized with mounting horror from pre-Christian codices preserved in Vatican archives. "The seal of Kronos unbound," he whispered, transcribing frantically as the ritual unfolded below his distant vantage point. Augustus raised his arms skyward, his voice carrying impossibly across the distance. "We have prepared the vessel. We have nourished the covenant. We now surrender individual limitation to become eternal conduits." The family members simultaneously drew silver lancets across their temporal scars, throat, wrists, ankles, not drawing blood, but releasing something that glowed with cold blue luminescence. The substance flowed upward against gravity, forming a spiraling column above the mansion that punctured the atmospheric boundary, like an otherworldly spear. The consequences manifested with catastrophic immediacy. Throughout the parish, clocks shattered in synchronized destruction, their mechanisms rejecting fundamental temporal laws. Living creatures caught outside the boundary experienced their natural lifespans in reverse sequence. Infant birds within nests suddenly unfurled into mature specimens before dissolving back into unformed matter. Flowering plants retreated into seedlings before emerging again as blossoms, caught in perpetual transformative loops. Father Gautier watched in paralytic dread as the boundary itself pulsed outward with unprecedented velocity, expanding nearly half a mile in seconds rather than the methodical creep he had documented for months. The acceleration threatened to engulf St. Martinville by nightfall rather than autumn. What occurred next defied rational explanation. The elderly priest observed a solitary figure emerging from Bellwood's rear entrance, Montgomery Quincy, or what remained of him. The emaciated form, bent with unnatural age, yet moving with purposeful determination, carried what appeared to be an ancient stone tablet recovered from the asylum where he had been imprisoned. As Montgomery approached the ritual formation, Augustus's expression transformed from rapturous communion to stark terror. Father Gautier could not hear the exchange, but witnessed the prodigal son raise the tablet toward the spiraling column of temporal essence. "The counterweight of Kronos," Gautier breathed, recognizing the artifact from the same forbidden texts. The balance restored. The collision between opposing temporal forces produced a cataclysmic implosion. The luminous column collapsed upon itself, drawing the expanded boundary inward with violent force. The shimmering dome contracted rapidly, compressing back toward Bellwood with such intensity that the mansion itself appeared to fold inward, its architectural dimensions bending in ways that violated Euclidean geometry. In that moment of temporal collapse, Father Gautier glimpsed something ancient and vast retreating from our reality, a presence that had dwelled within the convergence since before human comprehension of time itself, now dragging its unwitting human vessels into whatever dimensional interstice it called home. By dawn, St. Martinville emerged from the longest night in parish memory. Witnesses reported the darkness had possessed an unnatural density, as though night itself had been compressed and distilled to its purest essence. As sunrise finally pierced the gloom, illuminating dew-laden fields with golden light, townspeople ventured cautiously from homes where clocks once again marked seconds with methodical precision. The road to Bellwood stood empty, bordered by cypress trees that had shed their unnatural verdancy, now properly seasonal in their appearance. Birds sang with ordinary cadence, neither accelerated nor eerily protracted. The boundary that had shimmered like heat above summer stones was gone, reality once again consistent and unmarred by temporal distortion. Those brave enough to approach the estate discovered a scene of profound transformation. Where the Greek Revival mansion had stood proudly for 15 years, there remained only a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by untouched gardens. No debris, no foundation stones, no evidence of catastrophic destruction, merely an absence, as though Bellwood had been meticulously excised from existence with supernatural precision. Parish records document curious after-effects among those who had resided within the boundary's influence. Children who had experienced unnatural aging found themselves restored to proper development, though many retained strands of silver hair as permanent reminders. Elderly residents who had briefly recaptured youth reverted to age-appropriate conditions, yet often demonstrated unusual clarity of memory, recalling events from centuries past with disturbing accuracy. Most peculiar were the 7 marble plinths Augustus had installed. These remained precisely where they had stood, but their surfaces had transmuted from polished white stone to obsidian glass, the Etruscan inscriptions now appearing as though suspended within their depths rather than carved upon their surfaces. When touched, witnesses reported sensations of vertigo, accompanied by momentary glimpses of the Quincy family, frozen in attitudes of eternal surprise, temporal photographs preserved like insects in amber. The missing doctor, Thaddeus Marlowe, reappeared 3 days after the implosion, discovered wandering the parish boundary with no recollection of the preceding 8 months. His journal contained entries dated centuries into the future, written in his unmistakable hand yet describing technologies and events that defied contemporary understanding. More disturbing still was his persistent habit of completing others' sentences before they spoke, as though his perception remained slightly askew from conventional temporal flow. Father Gautier's final letter to the Archbishop contained a warning that would remain sealed in diocesan archives until 1923. We have witnessed not an ending, but a postponement. The Quincy's merely opened a door that was never meant to be unlatched. Though Montgomery's intervention collapsed their particular covenant, the breach between natural time and something older remains. The hunger that Augustus awakened has tasted human potential and found it pleasing. It will seek new vessels, new locations where the barriers between moments grow thin. To those who discover this account, remain vigilant against those who promise to conquer time's sovereignty, for such conquest comes at costs no mortal soul should bear. In the decades that followed, the circular void where Bellwood once stood remained inexplicably barren. Neither grass nor wildflower took root within its perfect circumference, though vines and saplings eventually reclaimed the surrounding gardens with ordinary vigor. Local children named it the Devil's Pocket Watch, and even the most rational minds felt an instinctive aversion to crossing its boundary, as though some primal human instinct recognized that within that space, the fundamental contract between humanity and time had once been catastrophically breached. The void where Bellwood once stood became a cartographic anomaly, a perfect absence on parish surveys that confounded successive generations of mapmakers. Land registry officials, compelled by bureaucratic necessity to document all properties within St. Martinville's jurisdiction, created increasingly elaborate classifications for the circular emptiness, non-parcellable terrain, jurisdictional exception, and finally, with admirable pragmatism, temporal discontinuity. What records could not capture was the peculiar quality of silence that pervaded the site. Not merely an absence of sound, but a cessation of time's ordinary murmur, that subliminal hum that accompanies every living moment. Those who ventured to its edge described a sensation of standing at the precipice of a vertical eternity, as though the horizontal progression of seconds had been upended and reconfigured into a bottomless shaft. The Atchafalaya Basin had always harbored secrets beneath its cypress-shadowed waters, but the Quincy incident revealed how thin the membrane between ordinary existence and preternatural realms had always been in this particular corner of Louisiana. The indigenous Chitimacha had understood this porousness, incorporating it into their spiritual cosmology rather than attempting conquest over it. European ambitions, by contrast, invariably sought dominion over nature, over flesh, over time itself. Augustus Quincy represented merely the culmination of colonial arrogance, the belief that ancient forces could be harnessed through sufficient will and sacrifice, particularly sacrifice exacted from others. His covenant with what dwelled beneath Bellwood merely formalized the exploitation that plantation society had already institutionalized. The temporal vampirism he practiced differed only in its supernatural manifestation from the more mundane extraction of life force through enforced labor. Perhaps most disturbing were the philosophical implications that rippled outward from Bellwood's implosion. If time itself could be manipulated, harvested, and redistributed, what remained sacred or immutable? Theologians at New Orleans Seminary produced voluminous treatises reconciling biblical chronology with the possibility of temporal fluidity. Natural philosophers debated whether the Quincy phenomenon represented an aberration or merely revealed a fundamental truth about reality's malleable architecture. Father Gautier, in his final sermon before retirement, offered perhaps the most prescient observation. We have long understood time as a river flowing in one direction, carrying all lives toward the same distant ocean. The Quincy abomination suggests instead a vast, still lake, where ripples from any disturbance eventually reach every shore. What they awakened continues to reverberate, perhaps infinitely, through moments we consider safely past or comfortably distant future. The obsidian plinths, defying all attempts at removal or destruction, became objects of scholarly fascination and superstitious dread. University geologists who examined fragments chipped from their surfaces discovered microscopic layers alternating between substances identifiable to 19th century science and others that defied categorization entirely. More troubling was the observation that these layers appeared to reverse their sequence when examined on consecutive days, as though the material itself remained in temporal flux. By 1850, most residents of St. Martinville had adapted to the strange emptiness in their midst, the way human communities throughout history have accommodated themselves to dormant volcanoes or fault lines, with cautious respect and the collective understanding that some powers remain temporarily quiescent rather than permanently neutralized. In 1897, precisely 52 years after Bellwood vanished, distinguished members of the New Orleans Temporal Research Society assembled at the perimeter of what locals still called the Devil's Pocket Watch. The expedition, led by Professor Absalom Thorne of Miskatonic University, had secured permission from parish authorities after presenting credentials bearing presidential seals and European academic endorsements. The society chose the autumn equinox deliberately, that perfect fulcrum between seasons when the boundary between worlds demonstrates its greatest permeability. They erected brass instruments atop tripods of African blackwood, their delicate mechanisms calibrated to measure variations in what Professor Thorne termed chronological density. The professor himself, a silver-haired gentleman whose penetrating gaze suggested familiarity with realities beyond ordinary perception, directed operations with pocket chronometer in hand. "Extraordinary," he murmured, observing how the device's hands rotated in contrary directions when extended over the circumference. The void maintains perfect equilibrium, neither accelerating nor decelerating temporal flow, but rather suspending it entirely. The Quincy's didn't merely harness time, they excised themselves from its continuum. Most remarkable among the Society's discoveries was the unearthing of a small lead box containing what appeared to be Elijah Quincy's final journal, preserved in the peculiar stasis field at the void's edge. The brittle pages, when carefully transcribed, revealed the terrible culmination of Augustus's ambition. Not mere longevity, but complete temporal autonomy. "Father believes he has mastered the covenant," wrote the youngest Quincy in feverish script, "but I have studied the basement texts more thoroughly than he suspects. The entities beneath Bellwood never intended partnership but possession. They grant temporal manipulation only as prelude to complete dimensional annexation." Montgomery understood this truth during his European travels, where he encountered similar convergences in Carpathian mountain villages, where entire families vanished yet continued appearing in successive generations' portraits, unchanging amid evolving fashions. Professor Thorne's analysis confirmed what Father Gautier had instinctively understood. The Quincy's had become trapped between moments, neither fully existing in conventional reality, nor entirely translated to whatever dimensional interstice their covenant had accessed. The implosion Montgomery triggered had not destroyed the family, but suspended them in perfect temporal equilibrium, a state neither living nor dead, but perpetually poised between heartbeats. Most haunting was the final expedition photograph, developed weeks later in New Orleans. While the researchers appeared normally in the foreground, the background revealed gossamer silhouettes surrounding the void, 5 human figures frozen in postures of realization, their features eternally captured in the precise instant they understood the true nature of their covenant. Their forms, translucent yet unmistakable, appeared simultaneously youthful and impossibly ancient, as though all potential ages existed concurrently within each spectral outline. The Temporal Research Society's conclusions, published in private monographs circulated only among select academic institutions, suggested that what the Quincy's had encountered beneath Louisiana's swampy soil was neither supernatural nor mystical, but rather an aspect of universal architecture that human consciousness was never designed to perceive, let alone manipulate. The St. Martinville Historical Society archives contain one final document pertaining to the Quincy anomaly, a weathered leather journal discovered in 1927 during foundation excavations for the parish courthouse. Carbon dating places its creation precisely 5 years before Augustus Quincy purchased the Bellwood property, yet the handwriting matches his with unnerving exactitude. The document, colloquially known as the Prescient Ledger, suggests the most terrifying possibility of all, that the Quincy's were never the architects of the temporal covenant, but rather its intended instruments. "I dreamt again of the house that does not yet exist," begins the first entry, dated 1824. "It calls to me across 20 years, a beacon pulsing with invitation. The sensation grows stronger with each lunar cycle. The certainty that somewhere in Louisiana's mist-shrouded wilderness awaits a convergence prepared specifically for our bloodline." Subsequent pages reveal Augustus Quincy experienced recurrent visions of Bellwood's completed structure down to architectural minutiae he could not possibly have known, precise measurements of rooms not yet built, exact positions of windows that would later channel solstice light onto specific floor markings, foundation stones carved with symbols whose meanings he somehow understood despite their absent presence in any known language. Most disturbing is his description of entities he termed the architects of moments, beings that existed perpendicular to conventional temporal flow. They move not forward or backward through time but sideways, perceiving all human history simultaneously as one might view a tapestry from above. They require anchors within our linear progression, families whose genetic composition allows for temporal permeability. The Quincy bloodline, with its peculiar hereditary sensitivity to chronological fluctuations, represents an ideal vessel. The final pages contain drawings of human anatomical structures modified to accommodate what Augustus called temporal conductivity, precisely the scarification patterns later observed on Evangeline's throat, Cordelia's collar, Montgomery's and Elijah's wrists. These modifications were not Augustus's innovation, but rather specifications provided by the entities themselves, communicated through dreams that felt more substantive than waking reality. Professor Emeritus Claudette Mouton of Tulane University, the foremost authority on Louisiana temporal anomalies, proposed in her definitive 1956 analysis that the Quincy's were merely the latest in a succession of attempted bridgeheads, families specifically cultivated across generations to create ideal conditions for what she termed cross-dimensional colonization. The Atchafalaya Basin's unique electromagnetic properties, combined with its spiritual significance to multiple indigenous cultures, created perfect conditions for entities existing outside conventional temporality to establish footholds within human comprehensible reality. "What makes the Quincy incident uniquely valuable to scholarly understanding," wrote Professor Mouton, "is not that they succeeded where others failed, but that they failed where others may have succeeded. Throughout human history, how many families have quietly vanished, their absence rationalized through mundane explanation, while actually achieving what the Quincy's nearly completed. The true horror lies not in one plantation's temporal aberration, but in the possibility that such incursions have occurred repeatedly, leaving behind only faint ripples in historical record, strange circles where nothing grows, inexplicable gaps in genealogical continuity, or generations of families showing uncanny resemblances across centuries that defy genetic possibility. The void's enduring presence transformed St. Martinville's collective consciousness in ways that transcended mere historical curiosity. By the early 20th century, the perfect absence where Bellwood once stood had become integrated into regional identity, a philosophical conundrum made manifest in landscape, challenging fundamental assumptions about reality's fixed nature. Local agriculture developed curious adaptations to accommodate the anomaly. Farmers planted their rows in concentric circles around the void, having observed that crops grown in this pattern yielded harvests of remarkable vitality. These chrono-responsive cultivations, as agricultural journals eventually termed them, produced vegetables with extended shelf life and fruits that ripened with supernatural precision, as though the plants themselves had absorbed marginal control over their temporal progression. The linguistic imprint proved equally profound. St. Martinville's regional dialect incorporated unique temporal prepositions absent from standard French or English, subtle conjugations that distinguished between ordinary duration and moments experienced near the void. When elderly residents instructed children to avoid the site, they employed verbal forms that simultaneously conveyed past incident and future possibility. A grammatical innovation unconsciously evolved to address the non-linear causality associated with the Quincy phenomenon. Architecture throughout the parish reflected unconscious defensive measures against temporal instability. Buildings constructed after 1845 incorporated curious structural elements: doorways with offsetting lintel stones, window placements that prevented direct sight lines to the void, foundation patterns that mimicked protective sigils. No ordinance mandated these features. They emerged organically through collective intuition, as though human instinct had developed specialized adaptations to chronological threats. The parish library maintained a separate classification system for documents related to the Quincy incident. These materials neither aged nor deteriorated, requiring special preservation protocols, not because of fragility, but due to their disconcerting tendency to update themselves. Archivists documented instances where handwritten notations appeared spontaneously on previously unblemished margins, or where ink periodically shifted color through spectrums invisible to conventional chromatic theory. Most profound were the psychological adaptations evident in subsequent generations. St. Martinville natives developed an intuitive temporal awareness absent in outside populations, an unconscious calibration to chronological inconsistencies that manifested in measurably faster reaction times and anomalous precedence recognition. Neurological studies conducted in 1962 revealed that children raised within 5 miles of the void demonstrated statistically significant abilities to anticipate events seconds before their occurrence, a faculty that diminished with distance from the anomaly's epicenter. The Quincy legacy persisted in bloodlines as well as landscape. Genealogical research identified 27 families whose ancestors had attended the fateful engagement soiree. Their descendants exhibited recurring peculiarities: unusual longevity counterbalanced by periods of accelerated aging, consistent birth of twins with asynchronous developmental patterns, hereditary heterochromia, where one eye appeared decades older than its counterpart. These genetic echoes suggested that temporal manipulation, once introduced into human biology, propagated through generations like an inheritance more persistent than wealth or property. The archives of St. Martinville continue to yield their secrets to those with sufficient perspicacity to discern truth from mundane record. Among the final documents to emerge from parish safekeeping was a waterlogged journal recovered in 2013 when Hurricane Esmeralda's floodwaters receded from the emptiness where Bellwood once stood. This manuscript, attributed to Montgomery Quincy during his asylum confinement, illuminates the ultimate truth of the family's covenant with time itself. What Montgomery discovered during his European sojourn was not merely the existence of other temporal anomalies, but the cyclical nature of the entity's manifestations. The architects of moments operated not from malevolence, but from incomprehensible necessity. They were temporal carrion feeders, consuming the byproducts of chronological decay that would otherwise accumulate within reality's fabric. Their covenant with receptive bloodlines represented symbiosis rather than predation, a natural function as essential to universal maintenance as decomposition is to forest ecology. "We mistook their nature entirely," Montgomery wrote in trembling script. "Father believed we commanded ancient powers, but we merely served as digestive organs for entities that process expired possibilities. The architects neither grant immortality nor steal years. They transmute potential futures that collapse into non-existence with each choice made. Every decision creates temporal detritus that must be processed, lest it accumulate and destabilize existence itself." Most revelatory was Montgomery's description of what truly occurred during the final implosion. The counterweight tablet he retrieved from ancient Ethiopian ruins contained no counterspell, but rather completed the covenant's intended culmination. The Bellwood anomaly was never meant to expand indefinitely, but to reach precise dimensional parameters before collapsing into itself, creating not destruction, but transcendence. "The family did not die nor suffer eternal imprisonment," he explained with uncanny clarity. "They achieved the covenant's ultimate purpose, translation into chronological omnipresence. They exist now as the architects always existed, perceiving all moments simultaneously, processing the entropy of collapsed potentialities. Their consciousness persists not as human identity, but as functional components of time's essential maintenance. This final truth perhaps explains the peculiar comfort many experience when approaching the void, not dread of annihilation, but unconscious recognition of necessary purpose. The emptiness represents not absence but completion, a perfect cycle where human ambition served universal function despite misunderstanding its role. The Quincy sought mastery over time but instead became integral to its continued operation. Their human identities surrendered to cosmic utility. The journal's final pages contain a statement of profound acceptance. I alone remained behind, my mind fractured by glimpsing realities humanity was never meant to comprehend. Yet I find strange peace knowing my family fulfills essential purpose. They sought immortality through temporal manipulation, never recognizing that time itself required their participation in processes beyond mortal understanding. In this way, perhaps they achieved the eternal existence they sought, though not as discrete personalities, but as functional aspects of reality's continued coherence. The land remembers what human minds cannot. In the decades that followed Montgomery's revelations, the perfect absence where Bellwood once stood developed an unusual property. It began to reflect, not in the manner of polished silver or still water, but in distortions of reality that manifested most prominently during equinoctial twilight. Those who gazed upon the void during these liminal moments reported seeing not their own reflections, but glimpses of lives they might have led had choices diverged, spectral alternatives shimmering like heat above summer roads. Anthropologists from prestigious universities arrived with instruments designed to measure conventional phenomena, departing with data that defied established paradigm. The circular emptiness maintained consistent dimensions, yet somehow contained spatial properties that exceeded its circumference. An impossibility by Euclidean standards, yet demonstrably evident to any who dared step to its perimeter with measuring devices. Objects placed at opposite edges registered distances greater than diameter should allow, as though the absence somehow expanded interior dimensions while maintaining external boundaries. Most remarkable were atmospheric conditions unique to this location. Barometric pressure within the void's periphery operated independently from surrounding weather patterns. During parish-wide thunderstorms, the circular absence remained inexplicably dry, invisible barriers deflecting rainfall around its circumference. Conversely, on cloudless days, visitors sometimes observed isolated precipitation confined precisely within its boundaries. Droplets that, when captured and analyzed, contain molecular structures inconsistent with terrestrial water. The Department of Energy established discrete monitoring stations in 1972, maintaining continuous observation for potentially hazardous emissions. Their classified reports, later declassified under Freedom of Information statutes, documented chronological radiation emanating from the site in pulsing waves corresponding precisely to lunar cycles. This previously unidentified energy appeared neither harmful nor beneficial to organic matter, but induced peculiar effects on electronic equipment. Digital clocks within the emission radius displayed non-sequential numerals. Recording devices captured sounds that preceded their activation. Most profound were dreams reported by those who slept near the void. Regardless of educational background or prior knowledge of the Quincy incident, sleepers described identical visions. A Greek revival mansion illuminated from within by blue-white light, occupied by 5 figures who moved with mechanical precision through endless rituals. These dreams conveyed not terror, but profound melancholy, as though witnessing beings engaged in eternal purpose without awareness of their own sacrifice. The Chitimacha elders, whose ancestors had recognized the site's significance before European arrival, maintained their distance while acknowledging its essential function. The empty circle completes its purpose, explained tribal historian Eleanor Celestine in 2015. What seems absence to your perception represents presence in dimensions human senses cannot access. The family who vanished serve as membranes between what is and what might have been. Without their function, possibility would stagnate rather than flow. As the 21st century progresses, St. Martinville exists in peculiar equipoise with its temporal anomaly, neither fully understanding nor entirely ignoring the void's significance. The perfect circle where Bellwood once stood remains unvegetated, undeveloped, and unmapped in conventional terms, yet integral to regional identity. Temporal maintenance proceeds without human comprehension, while the boundary between what was and what might have been continues its essential permeability. In this final accounting of the Bellwood anomaly, we must acknowledge the curious pilgrims who still arrive at the void's edge each equinox and solstice, seeking answers to questions their conscious minds cannot properly formulate. They come from distant universities and esoteric institutions, from theological seminaries and quantum research facilities, all drawn by the gravitational pull of unresolved mystery. The most recent expedition, led by Dr. Veronique Thibodeau, herself a distant relation to the property's owner before Augustus Quincy, brought ground-penetrating radar and quantum resonance equipment of extraordinary sensitivity. What they discovered beneath the surface defies conventional scientific categorization. Not empty Earth, but a perfect spherical depression extending precisely 44 feet downward, its interior surface polished to mirror smoothness by forces unknown. More remarkable still were the temporal echoes captured by their instruments, fragments of conversation from 1844 overlapping with words spoken yesterday and syllables that, by all linguistic analysis, belong to dialects yet to evolve. The Quincy family exists now as auditory palimpsests, their identities smeared across centuries like watercolors bleeding through parchment. The last living witness who recalls the original Bellwood, Mathilde's great-granddaughter Josephine, celebrated her 112th birthday this past spring, though physicians estimate her biological age at merely 73. When asked about the family that purchased her ancestor at New Orleans slave market, she responds with uncanny precision. They continue their harvest, though they no longer require physical form to gather what nourishes them. We all make contributions with each decision unmade, each possibility abandoned. Parish records document curious incidents persisting into our present century. Cameras directed at the void develop film showing Bellwood intact, though no structure has stood there for generations. Audio recordings capture piano music played in styles that combine 19th century technique with harmonic structures that musicologists identify as evolutionarily improbable. Most telling are the inexplicable botanical specimens that occasionally materialize at the circumference. Flowers with chromosomal structures suggesting adaptation to atmospheric conditions Earth has not experienced for millions of years, or may yet develop in centuries to come. The ultimate legacy of Bellwood rests not in supernatural terror but philosophical implication. The revelation that time itself requires maintenance, that human consciousness occasionally intersects with processes essential to reality's continued function. The Quincy sought immortality through temporal manipulation, never recognizing they were being prepared as components in mechanisms beyond human conception. As twilight descends upon the empty circle where ambitious dreams once manifested in columned grandeur, visitors sometimes report glimpsing 5 figures standing in perfect formation: Augustus and Evangeline, Montgomery and Cordelia, and young Elijah, who never was young, their forms translucent yet unmistakable against the deepening purple sky. They move with synchronized precision through rituals whose purpose transcends human understanding, eternal caretakers processing the infinite detritus of collapsed possibility. Their covenant with time continues, neither blessing nor curse but essential function, the necessary processing of roads not taken, choices unmade, potentials that collapse with each decision into non-existence. In their endless service, perhaps the Quincy's achieved the immortality they sought, though not as masters of temporal manipulation but as humble janitors of reality's continued coherence. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.